I still can't believe I'm sitting here, telling this story. It's one of those things you think only happens in movies or urban legends, but I lived it. And if you hear me out, you might never look at an abandoned school the same way again. It started when my friends and I decided to explore the old Jefferson High. You know the kind. Red brick, broken windows, a place that used to be full of life, but now sits like a corpse, decaying in the middle of a forgotten neighborhood. It had been abandoned for over 20 years, left to rot after a fire gutted part of it. People whispered stories about it, students who never made it out, teachers who went crazy, shadows seen in the windows at night, but of course we thought it was all nonsense. We were seniors, and it was supposed to be our big thrill before graduation. Just me, Katie, Josh, and Matt. We went late at night because the police patrolled the area during the day. Armed with flashlights and a cheap spirit box Matt had ordered online, we were ready to play ghost hunters. The first thing I noticed when we stepped inside was the smell. It wasn't just dust and mildew. It was something sour, like burnt plastic mixed with rot. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, but even in the dim light, the graffiti on the walls seemed off, not your usual tags or obscene doodles. These were strange symbols, jagged and looping in ways that hurt to look at. Creepy, right? Matt whispered, grinning like idiot. He was the brave one, or so he claimed. Perfect for some ghost hunting. We started in the main hallway. The lockers were rusted shut, and every step we took echoed unnaturally, as if the building were amplifying the sound. At first, we laughed and joked, trying to shake off the unease. Katie kept pretending to hear whispers, and Josh jumped at every creak. But then we reached the auditorium. That's when everything changed. The auditorium was massive, with a high, crumbling ceiling and rows of decaying seats. The stage was still intact, but the curtains hung in tatters, swaying slightly even though there was no breeze. Our flashlights caught the dust swirling in the air, and it felt like we'd walked into a different world. Matt set up the spirit box on the stage, grinning as he turned it on. At first, it was just static. Then came the voices, faint, distorted, like they were underwater. We all froze. "Who's here?" Matt asked, trying to sound brave. The box crackled, and then a single word came through, clear as day. "Stay." We all heard it. Katie let out a nervous laugh, but I could see her hands shaking. "Okay, that's freaky," Josh muttered. Matt, of course, was thrilled. "See? I told you this place was haunted." But the voice wasn't done. The static returned, louder this time, almost like a growl. And then another word, "Run." I don't know why we didn't listen. Maybe we thought it was a prank, or maybe we were too caught up in the adrenaline. Either way, we stayed. And that's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the auditorium. We swung our flashlights toward the noise, but there was nothing there. Just rows of empty seats. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it sounded like they were right in front of us. But there was still no one there. Katie started crying, and Josh whispered, "We should go." But before we could move, the spirit box crackled again, and this time it screamed. It wasn't words, just this horrible, guttural scream that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I dropped my flashlight and clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It was everywhere. And then, silence. Deafening silence. When I picked up my flashlight, Katie was gone. We called her name, searched the auditorium, but she was just gone. Matt said she might have run off, but I didn't believe him. She wouldn't just leave us. Not like that. We decided to split up. Stupid, I know. Josh and Matt went one way, I went another. I wandered through the hallways, my flashlight flickering like something out of a cliché horror movie. Every corner I turned felt wrong, like the building itself was watching me. The graffiti on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, the jagged symbols rearranging into something even more unsettling. And then I found her. Katie. She was standing in one of the classrooms, facing the blackboard. Her back was to me, and her head was tilted at this unnatural angle, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Katie?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed her hands. They were covered in something dark, ink, I thought at first, until I smelled the coppery tang. It was blood. She was writing something on the blackboard, over and over again. "They're here. They're here. They're here." I reached out to touch her shoulder, and that's when she turned around. Her face, God, I'll never forget it. Her eyes were completely black, and her mouth was twisted into this horrible, too-wide grin. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the lights in the room exploded, plunging everything into darkness. I ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get out. The hallways felt like a maze, twisting and stretching in ways that didn't make sense. I could hear Katie laughing behind me, this high-pitched, manic sound that didn't belong to her. When I finally found the exit, Josh and Matt were already there, gasping for air. "Where's Katie?" Josh asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We bolted to Matt's car and didn't stop driving until we were miles away. None of us spoke. The next day we went to the police, but they didn't find anything. No signs of Katie, no evidence we'd even been there. The school was just as empty and lifeless as it had been for years. But it wasn't empty. I know that now. Sometimes I still hear her laugh. Late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, it echoes in my ears. And I know I'll never be free of that place. None of us will.
Story number 2.
When I was a kid, there was an old, abandoned school about a mile from my house. Crestview Elementary, it was called. It shut down sometime in the 1980s after a string of incidents that no one seemed to want to talk about. The adults in the neighborhood avoided mentioning it, and even as kids, we weren't allowed near it. But of course, that just made it all the more intriguing. I wasn't the adventurous type, but my best friend Danny was. He was the kind of kid who loved dares and ghost stories. One autumn evening, when the air was crisp and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, he came to my house with a flashlight and a plan. "Let's go check out Crestview," he said, grinning ear to ear. I heard some high schoolers talking about weird noises coming from there. Bet it's haunted. I tried to say no, but Danny had a way of pulling you into things you didn't want to do. So, after some convincing, we grabbed our flashlights and headed out. The school sat at the edge of a small, wooded area. Its red bricks were faded and the windows were shattered. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate was bent, leaving just enough room for us to squeeze through. As we stepped inside, the wind rustled the dead leaves, making it sound like whispers were following us. The air grew colder as we approached the main entrance. The heavy wooden doors hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the breeze pushed them. Danny, ever the brave one, pushed them open wider and stepped inside. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, papers yellowed with age, and strange stains that I didn't want to think about. Lockers lined the walls, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. The faint smell of mold and something metallic lingered in the air. Danny's flashlight swept across the hallway. "Let's check out the gym," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. We made our way down the hall, our footsteps crunching on the debris. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed alive. I tried to focus on Danny's flashlight beam, but my eyes kept darting to the corners where the darkness felt too thick, too oppressive. When we reached the gym, the doors were stuck. Danny gave them a hard shove, and they groaned open with a sound that made my stomach twist. Inside, the gym was cavernous, the moonlight filtering through the broken windows in eerie beams. The basketball hoops were rusted, their nets long gone. Bleachers lined the walls, their wood warped and splintered. Danny laughed. "Creepy, huh? Perfect spot for a haunting." I didn't answer. My flashlight caught something in the middle of the gym floor, a single child-sized shoe, scuffed and worn. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. I pointed it out to Danny, but he just shrugged. "Probably left by some other kids exploring," he said. "Come on, let's check out the classrooms." As we turned to leave the gym, a loud bang echoed behind us. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Danny's flashlight shook slightly in his hand, but he forced a grin. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The classrooms were worse. Desks were overturned, and the blackboards were covered in strange, chalky scrawls. Most of it was illegible, but a few words stood out, things like help and leave. One blackboard had a drawing of a figure, crude and childlike, with hollow circles for eyes and a wide, jagged mouth. "Creepy," Danny whispered, running his hand over the drawing. "Wonder who drew this." As he said that, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. We froze, our flashlights pointed toward the door, but the hallway beyond was empty. "Probably an animal," Danny muttered, but even he didn't sound sure. "Let's keep going." Reluctantly, I followed him. The tapping grew louder as we moved, echoing around us. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We turned a corner and found ourselves in the cafeteria. It was in shambles. Tables overturned, chairs scattered, and the stench of mildew hanging heavy in the air. Danny's flashlight swept across the room, landing on the serving counter. And that's when we saw it, a shadow. It darted behind the counter, too fast to be human, but too solid to be a trick of the light. Danny gasped, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But we should." Before he could finish, the lights flickered. Not our flashlights, the overhead lights, which shouldn't have been working at all. They buzzed and crackled, casting the room in an eerie, strobe-like glow. The shadow reappeared, this time closer, standing in the middle of the cafeteria. It wasn't just a shadow, it had form, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was just like the drawing on the blackboard. Hollow eyes and that jagged, too-wide mouth. It tilted its head toward us, as if studying us, and then it moved. Not walked, moved. One moment it was across the room, and the next it was mere feet away. I screamed, and Danny grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the door. We ran blindly through the hallways, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the pounding of my heartbeat. The tapping followed us, louder now, like it was right behind us. I didn't dare look back. When we finally burst through the front doors, the cold night air hit me like a slap. We didn't stop running until we were back at the bent gate. Only then did we turn around. The school was silent, dark, no flickering lights, no tapping, no shadow. It looked just as lifeless as it had when we first arrived. But I knew better. Neither of us spoke on the walk home. Danny tried to laugh it off the next day, calling it a great scare, but I knew he was just as shaken as I was. We promised never to go back, and we kept that promise. A few weeks later, I heard that the old school caught fire again, burning completely to the ground. No one knows how it started, but part of me wonders if something in there wanted to stay hidden, wanted to make sure no one else would come looking. Even now, years later, I can't forget the way it looked at us, like it knew we didn't belong, like it was angry. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that tapping again, slow, deliberate, like a reminder.
Story number 3.
Growing up in a small Midwestern town, I always heard whispers about Roosevelt High. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since a tragedy no one liked to talk about. Some said a teacher had lost his mind and attacked his students. Others claimed the school was built on cursed land. Whatever the truth, it was left to rot, a decaying skeleton in the middle of nowhere. For years, it was the centerpiece of dares and urban legends. Kids would swear they'd seen shadows moving inside or heard faint screams echoing at night. I thought it was just nonsense, until I experienced it myself. It happened the summer after I graduated high school. My friends and I were bored, itching for something to do before we all went our separate ways for college. The idea came up during a late-night bonfire. Spend the night in Roosevelt High. The suggestion was met with laughter and a little hesitation, but peer pressure is a powerful thing. By midnight, we were standing at the edge of the property. The building loomed ahead of us, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the moonlit sky. The windows were shattered, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges. The air felt heavy, like the place was holding its breath. "All right," said Liam, the ringleader of our group. "Let's go in. First one to chicken out buys pizza." We laughed, but it was forced. None of us wanted to admit we were scared. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in what used to be the main hallway. Our flashlights illuminated peeling paint, graffiti, and debris. Lockers lined the walls, their doors ajar and rusted. The smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. "Let's split up," Liam suggested, grinning. "Cover more ground." It was a terrible idea, but no one wanted to seem cowardly, so we agreed. Liam went with Jenna, while I paired up with my best friend, Alex. We decided to explore the East Wing, where the classrooms were. The silence was deafening as we walked. Every creak of the floor, every distant drip of water made my heart race. We peeked into classrooms, finding overturned desks, broken chairs, and papers scattered like autumn leaves. One blackboard still had faint writing on it, math equations half erased, as if someone had left in a hurry. "Creepy," Alex muttered. We moved deeper into the wing, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight caught a strange mark on the wall, a handprint smeared in what looked like rust or dried blood. I pointed it out to Alex, but he shrugged it off. "It's just graffiti," he said, though his voice wavered. As we continued, we started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against a wall. Then came the whispers. They were too low to make out the words, but they were there, unmistakable. Alex froze, his face pale. Did you hear that? He whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. Probably Liam messing with us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't Liam. The whispers grew louder, coming from a classroom up ahead. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong. It was heavy, suffocating, and freezing cold. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, darting just out of sight. "Let's get out of here," Alex said, his voice shaking. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. I screamed, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Alex was pounding on the door, shouting, when the whispers returned. Louder now, more insistent. They seemed to surround us, coming from every corner of the room. Then the desks began to move. Slowly at first, us scraping against the floor, but then faster, slamming into each other like some unseen force was rearranging them. Alex grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. And then we saw it. In the far corner of the room, a figure began to take shape. It wasn't solid. It was more like a shadow, but darker and more defined. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, they were just empty sockets, black holes that seemed to suck in the light. It opened its mouth, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Alex and I bolted, throwing our weight against the door until it finally gave way. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, only to find Jenna and Liam running toward us. Jenna's face was streaked with tears, and Liam looked like he'd seen a ghost. "We need to leave," Jenna sobbed. "Now." We didn't ask questions. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The building seemed alive now, doors slamming, lockers banging, whispers chasing us. When we finally made it to the window we'd climbed through, it felt like a miracle. We scrambled out, collapsing onto the grass outside. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the school. It was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. We all did. Liam finally broke the silence. "We're never talking about this," he said, his voice firm. "Ever." We nodded, too shaken to argue. But the experience stayed with me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that shadowy figure, its hollow eyes boring into me. I hear the whispers, faint but insistent, and I wonder if something followed us out that night, if the school wasn't just a building but a trap waiting for its next victims.
Story number 4.
The old Mill Creek Elementary was the place every kid in our small town whispered about. Long abandoned after a fire decades ago, the school stood like a haunted monument at the edge of the woods. The town had rebuilt a new school miles away, but the ruins of Mill Creek were never torn down. It became a place of legend, with stories of ghostly children wandering the halls, their laughter echoing in the night. I never believed in those stories. I thought they were just tales to scare kids like me. But everything changed the night I set foot inside. It started as a dare. My older brother, Jake, and his friends were hanging out at the house one night when they decided to visit Mill Creek. Being the youngest, I wasn't supposed to be part of their plans, but I begged them to let me come along. "You'll just slow us down, Ellie," Jake said, but after relentless pleading, he finally gave in. We arrived around midnight, armed with flashlights and phones. The school was even more imposing up close, its charred walls and shattered windows giving it a sinister look. The air felt colder here, and the silence was deafening. Even the crickets and owls seemed to avoid this place. Jake led the way, pushing open the rusted metal door. It screeched loudly, the sound echoing down the dark hallways. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of soot and decay. Our flashlights cast long, jagged shadows on the walls, and the floor was littered with debris, broken desks, scorched books, and remnants of a life left behind. "All right, split up," Jake said. "We'll cover more ground." "Are you crazy?" I blurted out. "We should stick together." "Don't be such a baby, Ellie," Jake shot back. "You wanted to come, remember?" Reluctantly, I followed him and his friend Mark while the others went the opposite direction. We moved down the main hallway, our footsteps crunching on broken glass. Every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from the ceiling, the distant creak of a door. It felt like the school was alive, watching us. We passed what used to be the library, its shelves collapsed and books scattered like leaves. Something about this room drew me in. "Let's check it out," I said, stepping inside. Jake rolled his eyes but followed me. The room was eerie, with the moonlight filtering through the broken windows, casting strange patterns on the floor. I wandered toward the back, where a row of toppled chairs lay in a heap. That's when I saw it. On one of the walls, written in what looked like ash or soot, were the words, "Help us." "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." He shone his flashlight on the words and laughed nervously. "It's just graffiti, probably left by some kids messing around." But it didn't look like graffiti. The letters were uneven, shaky, like they'd been scrawled in desperation. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the wall, a cold chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just cold. It was bone deep, a freezing sensation that made me yank my hand back. "We should go," Mark muttered, his voice shaky. Before we could move, we heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding. Jake swung his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. "Probably the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. We left the library and continued down the hallway, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadows seemed to shift when we weren't looking, and the giggling came again, closer this time. It wasn't playful, it was mocking, sinister. As we approached what used to be the gymnasium, the temperature dropped sharply. Our breath came out in white puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Jake pushed open the double doors, and they creaked loudly. The gym was a cavernous space, its ceiling partially caved in. Moonlight spilled through the gaps, illuminating the scorched floor and twisted metal bleachers. In the center of the room, something caught my eye. A small, charred desk sitting eerily out of place. "What's that doing here?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We approached cautiously. The desk was covered in ash, and on its surface were tiny handprints. They were too small to belong to an adult, and the sight of them made my stomach churn. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But before we could leave, the gym door slammed shut behind us. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room. I screamed, spinning around to see nothing but the empty doorway. Then the giggling returned, louder now, echoing all around us. It was followed by the faint sound of footsteps, light like a child's, running across the gym floor. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I saw them. 3 shadowy figures stood in the far corner, barely more than silhouettes. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, and their eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow. They stared at us, unblinking, as the giggling grew louder. Jake grabbed my arm. "Run." We bolted toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows began to move, gliding across the floor without making a sound. Mark was pounding on the door, screaming, when the shadows reached him. I'll never forget what I saw. The figures surrounded him, their shadowy arms reaching out. Mark's screams turned into gurgles as he collapsed to the ground, his flashlight rolling away. The figures turned toward us, their eyeless faces locked onto Jake and me. In a surge of adrenaline, Jake kicked at the door until it finally gave way. We stumbled into the hallway, not daring to look back. The whispers and giggles followed us as we sprinted toward the exit. When we finally burst outside, the silence was deafening. The school stood still, as if mocking us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to start the engine. We sped away, not saying a word. Mark was never found. The police searched the school, but there was no sign of him. Jake and I didn't tell them what really happened. Who would believe us? But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that school. To this day, I can't drive past Mill Creek without feeling that cold chill. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear faint giggles or see shadows moving just out of sight. I can't help but wonder if those children are still waiting, trapped in the ruins of a place that should have been forgotten.
Story number 5.
Everyone in town had heard of St. Augustine High, but no one dared go near it after dark. Closed for decades after a student went missing, the abandoned school had become a hotspot for urban legends. Stories of shadowy figures, disembodied voices, and phantom footsteps spread like wildfire, but no one could confirm them. That's because no one who went inside stayed long enough to find out. I wasn't the kind of person to believe in ghost stories. To me, they were just exaggerated tales to scare kids. So, when my friends dared me to spend the night in St. Augustine, I shrugged and agreed. It seemed easy enough. Just a night in an empty building. What could go wrong? It was nearly midnight when I arrived. The school loomed in the darkness, its broken windows like hollow eyes. The front doors were chained shut, but someone had pried open a side window, leaving enough space to climb through. With a flashlight in hand and my backpack slung over my shoulder, I squeezed inside, landing in what used to be a science lab. The air was heavy, smelling of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, revealing overturned desks, broken beakers, and faded posters peeling off the walls. I laughed nervously to myself. This isn't so bad, I thought. But as I made my way down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The halls were eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the building settling. My footsteps echoed too loud in the stillness. I passed classrooms filled with crumbling desks and warped chalkboards. Some walls were covered in graffiti, while others bore strange scratches that didn't look man-made. I chalked it up to animals, though the marks were too precise, too deliberate. I decided to set up camp in what used to be the library. The rows of bookshelves were mostly empty, their contents scattered across the floor in a soggy, moldy mess. I found a relatively clean corner and unrolled my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that this was no different from camping in the woods. The first hour passed uneventfully. I scrolled through my phone, texting my friends to let them know I was fine. But as I was about to put my phone away, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like paper being shuffled. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The rustling stopped. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but overturned furniture and scattered books. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "Get it together," I muttered. But the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just paper, it was footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving across the room. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam darting across the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the library, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a child, no older than 10, wearing a tattered school uniform. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. "Hey!" I called, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, but as soon as I did, the child turned and walked into the hallway, their footsteps echoing. Against my better judgment, I followed. "Wait!" I shouted, stepping into the hallway. The child was gone, but the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The sound of giggling echoed down the corridor, high-pitched and unnerving. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls. I turned to go back to the library, but the door I'd come through was gone. I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, and the walls were covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. Panic set in as I realized I was completely lost. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," I yelled, my voice cracking. The giggling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, filling my ears until I could make out the words, "Stay with us." I ran. I didn't care which direction, I just needed to get out. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, I tripped over something and fell hard onto the floor. Groaning, I reached out to push myself up, but my hand touched something soft and wet. I brought my phone up to illuminate the object and nearly screamed. It was a decaying shoe, small enough to belong to a child. Next to it was a pile of bones, scattered haphazardly. The whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, tears streaming down my face. The halls seemed to twist and shift around me, the walls closing in. Every door I tried was locked, and every turn led me deeper into the maze. Finally, I stumbled into the auditorium. The stage was dilapidated, its curtains hanging in tatters. Rows of broken chairs filled the space, and the air was even colder here, like stepping into a freezer. I made my way to the center, hoping to find another exit. That's when I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures stood in the aisles, their heads tilted unnaturally as they stared at me. Their faces were featureless, but their presence was overwhelming. They didn't move, but I could feel their hatred, their anger. I backed away, but my foot caught on something, and I fell hard onto the stage. The whispers turned to screams, piercing, agonized cries that filled the auditorium. The shadows began to move, gliding toward me with unnatural speed. "No!" I screamed, crawling backward. My hands found the edge of the stage, and without thinking, I dropped down and ran. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of moonlight ahead. The side window was still open. I didn't even hesitate. I threw myself through it, landing hard on the ground outside. The air felt different here, lighter, freer. I staggered to my feet and ran to my car, not daring to look back. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The giggling haunted my dreams, and every shadow seemed to hold a figure waiting to pounce. A week later, I saw the news. Another group of teens had gone to St. Augustine and hadn't come back. The police searched the school but found nothing, just like every other time. I wanted to tell them what I saw, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. I haven't been the same since that night. The whispers still follow me, and sometimes I catch glimpses of shadowy figures in the corner of my eye. I know they're waiting, and I know one day they'll come for me.
Story number 6.
It started as a silly tradition, urban exploration with my friends. Every year, we picked a new abandoned place to explore. Hospitals, factories, houses. But this year, we decided to go bigger. Someone suggested Cravenwood Elementary, the derelict school on the outskirts of town, and we all agreed without hesitation. We'd heard the rumors, of course, ghostly figures in the windows, laughter echoing from empty halls, but it was all nonsense, or so we thought. The night we chose was cold and moonless, a perfect setting for our thrill-seeking escapade. Armed with flashlights, a couple of cameras, and way too much confidence, the four of us, me, Ashley, Mark, and Jenna, made our way through the overgrown lot that surrounded the school. The building was a hulking shadow against the night sky, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. "This is going to be awesome," Mark whispered, grinning as he pushed open the rusted front door. It groaned loudly, as if warning us to stay out. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mold and something metallic. Our footsteps echoed as we entered the main hallway, our flashlights casting long, flickering shadows. Rows of lockers lined the walls, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. The peeling paint and broken tiles made it clear that no one had cared about this place in decades. We laughed and joked as we explored, trying to keep the mood light. Ashley found an old textbook with pages torn out and pretended to read a spooky story, while Mark climbed onto a desk and declared himself principal of Cravenwood Horror High. Jenna rolled her eyes at their antics, but even she seemed amused. About an hour in, we found ourselves in the gym. It was cavernous, with a rotting stage at one end and a basketball hoop barely clinging to the wall at the other. The floor was warped and covered in debris. As we spread out to explore, Ashley stopped suddenly, her flashlight aimed at the far wall. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" I replied, moving closer. "There," she pointed. It looked like, I don't know, a shadow. "It's probably just your light reflecting off something," Mark said, though he sounded less sure of himself than usual. But then Jenna gasped. "I saw it too," she said, clutching my arm. Something moved. We all stood frozen, staring at the wall. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "This place is just messing with our heads." Reluctantly, the others agreed, and we left the gym. The atmosphere felt different now, heavier, as if the building itself was watching us. The air grew colder as we made our way to the second floor, where the classrooms were. That's when we heard it, a faint giggle echoing down the hallway. We all stopped, our flashlights darting toward the sound. "Okay, who's messing with us?" Mark asked, but no one answered. The laughter came again, closer this time, and my stomach twisted in fear. "We should leave," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." "Come on," Mark said, though he sounded less confident. "It's probably just the wind or something." "Since when does the wind sound like a child laughing?" Ashley snapped. Before we could decide what to do, the laughter turned into a low, guttural moan. It reverberated through the hallway, shaking us to our core. Jenna grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's just go," I said, my voice shaking. We turned to head back the way we came, but the hallway didn't look the same. The lockers were gone, replaced by blank walls. The air felt oppressive, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind us. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that sound. We burst into a classroom and slammed the door shut behind us, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was eerily intact, with desks still arranged in neat rows and a chalkboard covered in faded writing. "This isn't right," Jenna whispered, looking around. "This wasn't here before." Before I could respond, the chalkboard began to squeak. We all turned to see words appearing on it, as if written by an invisible hand. "Why are you here?" Ashley screamed, and Mark backed toward the door. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice breaking. The door slammed shut on its own, the handle twisting violently as if something was trying to keep us in. The room grew colder, our breaths visible in the air. The desks began to creak and groan, moving slightly on their own. "Stop!" Jenna cried, but whatever was in the room wasn't listening. The laughter returned, louder now, filling the space with an unnatural echo. Shadows began to gather in the corners, coalescing into shapes that looked almost human. They moved toward us, their forms flickering like a faulty projection. I grabbed a desk and shoved it toward the nearest shadow, but it passed through like smoke. "What do you want?" I shouted, desperate for an answer. The chalkboard changed again, the words scrawling themselves faster than before. Stay. Forever. That was it. I wasn't waiting to see what happened next. I grabbed Jenna's hand and yanked the door open, dragging her out into the hallway. Mark and Ashley followed, their flashlights flickering wildly. The hallway was different again, stretching longer than it should have. Doors appeared and disappeared, and the laughter echoed around us, joined by the sound of running footsteps. It felt like the school was alive, shifting and changing to trap us. We ran blindly, turning corners and sprinting down staircases that didn't seem to lead anywhere. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't stop. The shadows were everywhere now, moving along the walls and ceiling, reaching for us with elongated arms. Finally, we found the front door. It was wide open, moonlight streaming through. We didn't question it, we just ran. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the laughter stopped and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. None of us said a word as we piled in, slamming the doors shut. Mark peeled out of the parking lot, his hands shaking on the wheel. That night, we swore never to speak of what happened, but the experience stayed with us. I still hear the laughter sometimes, late at night, and I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out of that building.
Story number 7.
When I first moved to Charleston, I had no idea what I was getting into. The rent was cheap, and the apartment seemed decent, a historic brownstone with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors. It had charm, as the realtor put it. But what sold me was the rent. It was a steal in a city where housing was notoriously expensive. I didn't question why. From the moment I moved in, things felt off. The air was always heavy, no matter how many windows I opened. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners longer than they should, but I chalked it up to the quirks of an old building. I'd always been rational, dismissive of ghost stories and the supernatural. The first week passed without incident, though the nights were eerily quiet. The silence felt unnatural, as if the world outside the apartment ceased to exist after dark. It wasn't until the second week that I started hearing the knocks. They were faint at first, barely noticeable, just a soft tap, tap, tap on the walls. I thought it was my neighbors. But when I asked around, the other tenants swore they hadn't heard anything. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when the knocking started again. This time it was louder and more deliberate, echoing through the apartment. It came from the wall behind my bed. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear against the wall, hoping to catch the sound of a neighbor moving furniture or something mundane. But there was only silence. Then came the voice. A whisper, faint and chilling, drifted through the wall. "Come closer," it said, dragging out each word like a predator savoring its prey. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on every light in the apartment. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Objects moved on their own. Keys left on the kitchen counter would appear on the floor. My coffee mug slid across the table when I wasn't looking. Once I came home to find all the cabinets in the kitchen wide open. My landlord dismissed my complaints, blaming the building's age and settling foundation. One evening, I invited my friend Sarah over, desperate for company. I didn't want to be alone in that apartment anymore. She arrived with wine and her usual skepticism. When I told her about the knocking and the whispering, she laughed it off. "Old buildings are creepy. You're just psyching yourself out," she said. But her demeanor changed as the night went on. Around 11 p.m., the knocking started. Sarah froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "That's not normal," she whispered. "It's been happening every night," I said, my voice trembling. We followed the sound to the living room wall. The knocks were rhythmic now, almost like a code. Sarah tapped back, laughing nervously. "See? It's probably just pipes or something." The knocking stopped. For a moment, the apartment was silent. Then the voice returned, louder, more insistent this time. "Why are you here?" Sarah's face drained of color. "That wasn't pipes," she stammered. The lights flickered and a cold draft swept through the room. The temperature plummeted and we could see our breath fogging the air. Suddenly, the knocking turned into pounding, reverberating through the walls and shaking the floor. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, grabbing my arm. But as we headed for the door, it slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking into place. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The room grew impossibly dark, the shadows swallowing the light. A low growl emanated from the corner, where the darkness seemed to thicken and take shape. A figure emerged. A tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes that burned like embers. Its mouth twisted into a jagged grin as it stepped closer. "Leave," it hissed, its voice layered with guttural undertones. Sarah screamed, fumbling with the lock. I grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure, but it passed through as if it weren't solid. The entity didn't flinch. It just stared at us, its grin widening. Finally, Sarah managed to wrench the door open and we bolted into the hallway. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. That night, I stayed at Sarah's place, too afraid to go back to the apartment. I called the landlord the next morning and demanded to know the building's history. At first, he was evasive, but after I threatened to involve the city, he relented. The apartment had a dark past. In the 1920s, it had been a boarding house, and one of the tenants, a recluse named Harold Greaves, was rumored to have been a murderer. His victims were never found, but locals believed he buried them within the walls of the building. He was eventually lynched by a mob, but his spirit was said to haunt the property. Over the years, multiple tenants had reported strange occurrences. Some had even fled in the middle of the night, never to return. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront whatever was in the apartment. I couldn't afford to break the lease, and I was tired of living in fear. I bought sage, holy water, and a crucifix, determined to cleanse the space. That evening, I returned to the apartment with Sarah. We began the ritual, lighting the sage and reciting prayers. At first, everything was quiet, but as we moved through the rooms, the temperature dropped again. The shadows thickened and the knocking returned, louder and angrier than before. "Leave us alone," I shouted, holding the crucifix aloft. The entity appeared again, its form more defined this time. It towered over us, its eyes blazing with hatred. The air grew heavy, and an invisible force knocked the crucifix out of my hand. "You will never leave," it growled, its voice shaking the walls. Sarah screamed as the entity lunged toward us. In a panic, I grabbed the holy water and threw it at the figure. It shrieked, a sound so piercing it felt like it would shatter my eardrums. The shadows recoiled, and the figure dissolved into smoke. The apartment fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter, almost normal. But I knew it wasn't over. I moved out the next day, breaking the lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't risk taking anything that might have been tainted. Sarah and I never spoke of the experience again, but sometimes I catch her staring off into space, a haunted look in her eyes. As for the apartment, still there, its windows dark and lifeless. Occasionally I hear rumors of new tenants moving in, but they never stay long. The building seems cursed, its walls hiding secrets that will never be laid to rest.
Story number 8.
I never thought I'd return to the old playground at the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place that drew people in. It had been abandoned for decades, overgrown with weeds and choked by creeping ivy. Rusted swings hung limp from their chains, and the carousel squeaked in the wind like a haunted whisper. Growing up, the local kids dared each other to spend a night there, but everyone knew better than to accept. Except for me. It was a summer night. Years ago, when I first stepped onto that cursed ground. My friends and I were 15, cocky and drunk on teenage bravado. The story went that a teacher at the old elementary school, Miss Grayson, had lost her mind and murdered 3 students during a field trip to the playground. She buried their bodies beneath the equipment, or so the rumors said. The school was demolished soon after, but the playground remained, rotting and forgotten. The challenge was simple: stay until sunrise. If you did, you'd earn eternal bragging rights. No one had ever made it, but that night I was determined to be the first. My best friend Tyler came with me. We brought flashlights, snacks, and an old baseball bat for protection, just in case. The air felt heavy as we climbed the broken fence, like we were stepping into another world. The playground loomed before us, eerily still under the moonlight. The shadows seemed darker there, deeper, as if they swallowed the light whole. "It's just an old playground," Tyler said, his voice wavering. "Nothing to be scared of." "Right," I replied, though my hands were trembling. We set up near the carousel, which was covered in rust and grime. Tyler pulled out his phone to play music, but the battery died almost immediately. Annoyed, he shrugged it off, but I noticed the way his eyes darted around the playground. The first hour was uneventful. We laughed, told stupid jokes, and tried to outspook each other with made-up ghost stories. But as midnight approached, the air grew colder. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell. I tried to ignore it, but Tyler wrinkled his nose. "Do you smell that?" he asked. "Yeah," I admitted. "Probably just a dead animal or something." But the smell didn't fade. It grew stronger, clinging to the back of my throat like a sickness. Tyler shined his flashlight around, but the beam barely pierced the thick darkness. That's when we heard the first sound, a soft, metallic clink coming from the swing set. "Wind," Tyler said quickly, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The swings weren't moving. They hung motionless, as if the air itself avoided them. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low creak. My flashlight flickered as I turned it toward the jungle gym. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a small child standing at the top, staring down at us. But when I blinked, it was gone. Tyler grabbed my arm. "Let's go." "We can't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We haven't even made it halfway. This is stupid, man. Something's not right." He wasn't wrong, but my pride wouldn't let me leave. "Just a few more hours," I said. "We'll be fine." But we weren't. Around 1 a.m., the noises started. Whispers, faint and unintelligible, drifted through the playground. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tyler spun in circles, clutching the baseball bat like a lifeline. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure darted between the carousel and the slide, too fast to be human. Tyler saw it too, judging by the way he froze. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. Maybe it's just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. Animals didn't move like that. The carousel began to spin on its own, the rusted metal shrieking as it turned. Tyler dropped the bat and grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." This time, I didn't argue. We ran toward the fence, but the air grew thick, almost syrupy, slowing us down. It felt like running through water. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. My flashlight flickered again before dying completely. "Tyler?" I called, my voice barely audible over the noise. "I'm here," he shouted from somewhere ahead. I stumbled, tripping over a root or a rock. I couldn't tell. The ground felt soft, like it was pulsing beneath me. Panic set in as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. I clawed at the earth, trying to stand, when I felt a hand grab my ankle. It was small and cold like ice. I kicked wildly, but the grip tightened. When I looked back, I saw them. 3 children, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their mouths stretched into unnatural, jagged grins. "Stay," one of them said, its voice echoing in my head. I screamed, pulling myself free and scrambling to my feet. Tyler was at the fence, shouting my name. I ran as fast as I could, the children's laughter chasing me. When I reached the fence, Tyler helped me climb over. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, gasping for air. We never spoke about what happened that night. Tyler moved away a year later, and we lost touch. But I couldn't shake the memories, or the nightmares. The children's faces haunted me, their voices echoing in my mind. A few months ago, I heard that the playground was demolished. They were building a new housing development on the land. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that whatever was there had been laid to rest. But last week, I drove past the site out of morbid curiosity. The houses looked normal enough, their windows lit with the warm glow of family life. But as I sat there, staring, I saw movement in the shadows. 3 small figures stood at the edge of the property, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait to see what they would do.
Story number 9.
I've always been a skeptic when it comes to ghost stories. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, tales of hauntings and cursed places were passed around like urban legends. One of the most infamous stories in our town was about the old Pine Hollow Elementary School. It had been abandoned for nearly 30 years, left to decay after a fire gutted the gymnasium. According to local lore, the fire had killed a janitor named Mr. Baker, and his ghost still roamed the halls, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to enter. I never believed any of it. That was until last October when my friends convinced me to explore the school with them. It was a dare, plain and simple, a stupid way to kill time on Halloween night. We thought we'd poke around, take some pictures, and maybe scare ourselves for fun. but what we found in Pine Hollow was far worse than we ever imagined. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Anna, her boyfriend Jake, and a new guy in our group, Sam. Sam was the one who brought up the idea, claiming he had a knack for exploring creepy places. He even brought a Ouija board, which I immediately dismissed as a gimmick. "This will make it fun," Sam said with a grin as we parked near the overgrown lot. The school loomed ahead of us, its broken windows like dark eyes staring into the night. The front doors were boarded up, but Sam assured us he knew a way in through the back. I wasn't thrilled about trespassing, but peer pressure won out. We followed Sam around the side of the building, where he led us to a hole in the chain-link fence. The back entrance was wide open, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. A musty smell wafted out, mixed with something metallic. "Probably just rust," Jake said, trying to sound brave. The inside was worse than I expected. The walls were covered in graffiti, and debris littered the floor. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing remnants of a life long gone. Desks flipped on their sides, faded posters peeling from the walls, and a chalkboard smeared with illegible writing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on broken glass. "This place is awesome," Sam whispered, his excitement undeterred. "Yeah, totally," Anna said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Can we go now?" "Not yet," Sam said, pulling the Ouija board from his backpack. "Let's do this in the gym." I didn't want to go any deeper into the school, but again I let myself get talked into it. The gym was the heart of the hauntings, according to legend. The janitor was said to have died near the storage room, where his ghost was most often seen. As we stepped into the gym, the air grew colder, almost unnaturally so. Our breath came out in visible puffs, even though it wasn't that cold outside. The room was a charred skeleton of its former self. The walls were blackened with soot, and the bleachers were warped and broken. Sam set up the Ouija board on the floor while the rest of us sat in a circle around him. "This is stupid," Anna muttered, but she didn't leave. "Everyone put your fingers on the planchette," Sam instructed. "And don't push it, or it ruins the whole thing." Reluctantly, we obeyed. The board felt slick and cold beneath my fingertips. Sam began asking questions, the usual cliches. "Is anyone here with us? Can you hear us?" At first, nothing happened. The planchette remained still, and I felt a small wave of relief. But then it moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it slid to yes. "Okay, who's messing with it?" Anna snapped, glaring at Jake. "It's not me," he said, looking genuinely startled. "Let's ask another question," Sam said, undeterred. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, spelling out BAER. A chill ran down my spine. Jake laughed nervously. "Good one, Sam. Real original." "I'm not doing it," Sam insisted, his eyes wide. "It's real." Before we could argue, a loud bang echoed through the gym. We all froze. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the storage room. "Let's check it out," Sam said, already standing. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "That's how people die in horror movies." "It's probably just an animal," he said, shrugging. But it wasn't. As we approached the storage room, the temperature dropped further. The door was slightly ajar, and the smell of burnt wood and something foul wafted out. Jake pushed the door open with his flashlight, revealing a small, cramped space filled with old sports equipment. At first, it seemed empty. Then we saw it. In the corner, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Its clothes were tattered and scorched, hanging loosely from its skeletal frame. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw its eyes, 2 glowing hollow orbs. Anna screamed, and the figure moved. It stepped toward us with an unnatural gait, dragging one leg as if it were broken. The air around it seemed to warp like heat waves on asphalt. Jake grabbed Anna's arm, and we bolted, Sam close behind. I turned to follow, but I tripped on something. A broken hockey stick or a piece of wood. My flashlight rolled away, leaving me in darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. The figure was closer now, its hand reaching out toward me. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. Then, just as it was about to touch me, I heard Sam shout. He swung an old metal bat he'd found, and the figure dissolved into smoke, leaving behind a putrid stench. "Run!" Sam yelled, pulling me to my feet. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air. The night felt alive with tension, every shadow a potential threat. We piled into the car, speeding away without looking back. We never spoke about what happened that night, not even to each other. Anna moved to another town, and Jake broke up with her shortly after. Sam, who had seemed so fearless, refused to go near abandoned buildings again. As for me, I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its hollow eyes, its scorched frame. A few months later, I read that the town was finally demolishing Pine Hollow. They said it was for safety reasons, but I knew better. The school was cursed, its ghosts too real to be ignored. Sometimes I drive past the site, now an empty lot. It looks normal enough during the day, but at night it's a different story. Shadows move where they shouldn't, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingers in the air. I don't stop anymore, because some places aren't meant to be explored.
Story number 10.
I never believed in ghosts, curses, or anything paranormal. That's probably why I agreed to take the security job at the old Ashwood High School. The school had been shut down for nearly a decade after a string of mysterious incidents. Sudden blackouts, unexplained injuries, and one teacher who simply disappeared during a fire drill. The town whispered about the school being haunted, but I didn't buy it. When I got the job, my friends warned me. They said no one lasted more than a week, but I needed the money. The job was straightforward: patrol the grounds, check for trespassers, and make sure the local teenagers weren't sneaking in to vandalize the place. Easy enough, or so I thought. On my first night, the place felt eerie but manageable. The silence inside was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. The fluorescent lights in the hallways buzzed faintly, and every sound seemed to echo endlessly. I carried a flashlight, though most of the building still had power. The janitor's closet became my base of operations, where I had a radio and a small monitor that flickered between feeds from the aging security cameras. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the direction of the auditorium. It was so subtle I almost thought I imagined it. Grabbing my flashlight, I decided to check it out. The auditorium was massive, with rows of dusty seats and a stage that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air was colder there, and my breath fogged in front of me. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual, just the eerie remnants of a forgotten past. Then I noticed something. In the middle of the stage, a single chair faced the audience. That chair hadn't been there when I first did my rounds. I approached cautiously, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, and my flashlight flickered. I whipped around, but there was nothing behind me. I backed out of the auditorium quickly, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I returned to the janitor's closet, I checked the camera feed. The auditorium was empty, no chair on the stage, no movement. My stomach churned. Was I losing it already? The second night, things got worse. Around midnight, the power went out completely. I tried the radio, but it only emitted static. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the darkness itself were pressing against me. Armed with just my flashlight, I began my rounds. In one of the hallways, I saw wet footprints leading toward the science wing. They were small, like those of a child, and yet they shimmered as if freshly made. The temperature plummeted as I followed them, my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The trail ended at a classroom door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze. The room was in shambles, desks overturned, books scattered, and the faint smell of mildew in the air. But what caught my attention was the chalkboard. Written in large, jagged letters was a single word: leave. A sudden crash from the other side of the room made me spin around. A globe had fallen from a shelf, rolling to a stop at my feet. My flashlight flickered again, and I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner. Heart pounding, I backed out of the room and sprinted to the janitor's closet, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. When dawn finally came, I called my supervisor to report the power outage and the vandalism in the science wing. He dismissed my concerns, saying, "That place messes with your head. Just do your job." The third night was the worst. I was determined to stay rational, to prove to myself that whatever I was experiencing had a logical explanation. But as soon as I stepped into the building, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavier than before, and the silence was deafening. It felt as if the building were holding its breath, waiting. I started my rounds, avoiding the science wing and the auditorium. The hallways seemed longer than they had the previous nights, stretching endlessly into the dark. At one point, I heard faint giggling, like that of children, echoing from the cafeteria. When I reached the cafeteria, it was empty, save for the long rows of tables and chairs. Then I saw them. Handprints. Tiny, wet handprints covered the windows and the walls, trailing up to the ceiling. I felt a chill race down my spine. Suddenly, the giggling turned into screams. High-pitched, agonized screams that filled the room and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I made my way back to the janitor's closet. But when I reached the door, it was locked. I fumbled with the key, my hands trembling, but it wouldn't fit into the lock. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I turned, my flashlight beam shaking. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and staring. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her mouth was twisted into a ghastly smile. She raised one hand, beckoning me. I bolted. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The night was cold, but I felt as if I were burning up. I got into my car and drove away, leaving behind my flashlight and anything else I'd brought with me. I didn't care, I just wanted to get out. The next day, I quit. My supervisor didn't even seem surprised. "No one lasts long at Ashwood," he said, almost casually. Since then, I've tried to put that experience behind me, but it's not that simple. I still have nightmares, dreams where I'm back in the school, wandering its endless halls, hearing the screams and seeing that woman's face. Sometimes I wake up feeling like I can't breathe, as if the weight of the school is still pressing down on me. I don't know what's haunting Ashwood High, and I don't want to find out, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left alone.